Back in 1848, the political theorists and economists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote a little piece of work they called the Communist Manifesto. In their manifesto, Marx and Engels lay out their idea of historic materialism, arguing that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Marx and Engels believed that all of human history could be defined as a series of class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the working class, the exploiter versus the exploited, the oppressor versus the oppressed, etc., etc. Marx and Engels saw all political, economic, social, and government changes as a result of this class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And I think the same could be said for theater. Theater, in many ways, responds to political, social, and economic changes throughout history, and I don't think it's a stretch to apply the idea of historic materialism to the theater. With this project, I specifically wanted to explore how class conflict in Europe has influenced the history of European drama, starting in the Renaissance and going into the early Industrial Revolution. And I want to argue that class conflict has influenced many European plays and European playwrights, and that many European theatrical movements are in a response to class conflict throughout history. Let's start in England. England didn't enter into its own Renaissance until the 16th century, about when Elizabeth took the throne.
Throughout the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, most of English drama was religious, or liturgical drama. Think of Corpus Christi plays, morality plays, passion plays, theatrical representations of biblical stories and morals for a mostly illiterate population. As England entered into its Renaissance, and as Queen Elizabeth I banned these religious plays, liturgical drama would be replaced by primarily secular Elizabethan drama. As the end of feudalism forced many out of agriculture, people began to move off of farmland and urbanize.
The invention of the printing press and increased urbanization led to a changing theater audience, and more people were going to the theater as a whole.
The invention of the printing press also meant that literacy began to spread among the people of England. All of this expanded the theater-going audiences, and Elizabethan theaters came to serve both the rich and poor alike, though seating itself was often a designation of class. While audience members from every class could attend English theaters, artistic freedom was still controlled by the aristocracy in the form of patronage. The patronage model gave many playwrights and actors means to survive as artists, but it allowed for no ownership over the art being created. While acting was emerging as a profession, it still carried a stigma among the public. In order to be a professional actor, one had to work for members of the aristocracy. An actor's art was dependent on the continued patronage and approval of whatever noble under whom they worked. Playwrights were not much better off. Once a play was written, the playwright had no claim over its publishing or distribution, and these instead belonged to whatever company purchased the play. Playwrights had no means of protection or job security either. If content in their plays was deemed too controversial or inappropriate, playwrights would be ostracized or even jailed. In short, theater artists were often exploited by the aristocracy and were forced to cater to their sponsors. Art, however, has a tendency to challenge the rules, and despite artistic limitations, Elizabethan playwrights like Christopher Marlowe betrayed bureaucratic influences and rose to fame by writing about controversial and taboo subjects. In Dr. Faustus, a play about a man who gives his soul to the devil, Marlowe explores themes of sin and magic and throws religion and the belief of Christ into question. In Edward II, a play about the former King of England and the drama of court life, Marlowe criticizes the aristocracy's obsession with social status. He may have received financial support from the rich and powerful, but Marlowe did not simply make work to appease them. He understood theater as a tool of the people and gave the public the content that they wanted, even if it meant putting himself and his career in jeopardy. The themes he explored and stories he told were authentic and important to him, and he didn't let money silence or censor him. For those reasons, his work would go on to help define the Elizabethan theater and influence other dramatists for years to come, including Shakespeare.
At the same time England was entering its rebirth, another country was battling England for the title of the country to beat, the big powerhouse in Europe. And that country was Spain.
Under the rule of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Spain's economy boomed, and the arts flourished, the theater among them.
What allowed for this Spanish golden age? Well, the answer is a new form of exploitation, in the form of colonialism.
As European exploration and expansion reached the Americas, countries like Spain began colonizing and forming massive empires. Natural resources from the Americas, like gold and silver, obviously made Spain wealthy, but this wealth could only be attained by sinister and oppressive means. The indigenous populations of Central and South America were systematically killed or enslaved by Spanish colonizers, and entire civilizations were pillaged and ransacked. The Spanish were benefiting from the labor and cultivation of natural resources, but the natives were forced to suffer and slave away with no compensation and often with the threat of death or disease hanging over them. The new wealth pouring into Spain allowed for increased patronage of the arts and resulted in the golden age of Spanish drama. Spanish writers and dramatists were not blind to the exploitative economic model that patronized them, and the issue of colonialism can be seen in the works of two notable playwrights, Lope de Vega and Sor Juana. Lope de Vega Carpio, one of the most prominent playwrights of the Spanish Golden Age, wrote the play Fuente Ovejuna, which has many anti-colonial themes.
The play is about a small village of working-class people who suffer the abuses and the oppression of a rich commander set to watch over the village, and they ultimately decide to overthrow the commander and seek liberty from him.
The play argues against the cruel force that Spain exacted through colonization, and is practically a call to action for the overthrow of Spanish colonizers.
Fuente Ovejuna, one of the most famous works of the Spanish Golden Age, is literally about liberty from the oppressor and freedom for the working class.
Yet another example is the poet and playwright Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who personally witnessed the horrors of Spanish colonialism, living in Mexico herself. Her play, Loa of a Divine Narcissus, spoke out against Spain's cruelty and the genocide of natives, arguing that the Spanish possessed a shared humanity with the indigenous Americans.
The characters in the play, allegorical representations of the Americas and of Spanish conquest and religion, represent the pillaging of the Americas and the exploitation of the Native Americans living there.
At the end of the Loa, however, the characters come together and acknowledge that there isn't really much of a difference between them at all. Though her play is still pro-conversion, Sor Juana's critique of Spain's colonialism was radical for her time, and her writings probably opened the eyes of many Spanish readers to the oppression and exploitation occurring overseas.
Allow me now to travel north, and about 100 years in the future, to France. In the 17th century, after years and years of religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, France was finally beginning to hit its stride and entering into its own, under the reign of Louis XIV.
King Louis XIV directed global attention to France through his absolute style of rule and through his support of the arts. Louis XIV is famous for his expensive tastes and propensity for grandeur, the Palace of Versailles being a notable example of this.
But its expensive exploits merely masked the debilitating poverty that took hold over France and many of the common French people.
For the common people that made up the French working class, also known as the Third Estate, Louis XIV's reign was marked by famine, rising taxes, and religious persecution.
While aristocrats and foreign ambassadors were living it up with Louis XIV in the Palace of Versailles, the people of France were hungry, and they were angry, and the seeds of future rebellion were being sowed among them.
As King Louis XIV moved from Paris to Versailles, and aristocratic life further distanced itself from the common people, the comedy of manners genre rose with popularity. The comedy of manners genre is defined by plays that poke fun at and question the strict morality and conventions of bourgeois society, which was becoming more and more eccentric under Louis XIV. One of the playwrights responsible for popularizing the genre was the French dramatist and comedian Molière. Molière himself was born into the bourgeoisie, with his father working under Louis XIV, but he left the aristocratic life to pursue a career in theater. Because theater was largely funded by the state and the aristocracy, however, Molière often operated in bourgeois spaces and created works for bourgeois audiences. His writings, however, do not pull punches and often make fun of aristocratic morality, the very essence of what a comedy of manners is. His most controversial work, Tartuffe, drew inspiration from public theater forms like commedia dell'arte and stood in direct opposition to the stuffy morality and strict rules of French neoclassicism.
Tartuffe, in its critique of the hypocrisy of upper-class Catholics and clergy members, challenges the typical morality and stricture of bourgeois drama.
The character of Tartuffe is lascivious and an unabashed con-man, who manages to make a fool out of the rich Orgon. The play also critiques bourgeois social conventions like marriage and inheritance. Molière saw both into the worlds of the aristocracy and the common people of France, and had a unique perspective into the dynamics of class at the time. His utilization of class in plays like Tartuffe displays the common sentiment held towards bourgeois society, and as the bourgeoisie continued to grow and become even wealthier throughout Europe, Molière's observation of class conflict led to the popularity of the comedy of manners genre as a whole.
Molière's work was incredibly influential and challenged many ideas in France at the time, especially in French drama, and his work went on to shape drama for years to come, not only in France but throughout all of Europe. As Europe moves into the 18th century, the foundation is being laid for a massive revolution in industry that will forever change European life.
The 1700s see a rise in textile production and mills and early factories, causing many people to migrate from agricultural life to urban areas.
For the first time in European history, an industrial working class, bound by wages and subject to the abuse of bosses and factory owners, begins to develop.
Increased urbanization also results in the rise of a middle class, shop owners and craftsmen, who similarly struggle to get by.
The dawn of industry coincides with the re-emergence of a past theatrical form, and a theatrical form, I would argue, is distinctly proletariat, commedia dell'arte.
In Italian form, commedia dell'arte originated during the Renaissance and was born from street performance. Stock characters in commedia are meant to poke fun at the rich and poor alike. It's comedy for all walks of life. Commedia troupes were also an example of organized labor. They were actors and actresses who had ownership of their work and shared income equally among themselves. Italian playwright and librettist Carlo Goldoni popularizes commedia dell'arte years after its inception in the 18th century with plays like His Servant of Two Masters.
In The Servant of Two Masters, the protagonist Truffaldino is a goofy servant type, a Zani if you will, but I think his plight is relatable to the working and middle classes of the 18th century. The abuse and beratement and the ridiculous trials Truffaldino has to go through are obviously played up for laughs in the play and are a source of most of the play's comedy, but I think that they possessed a certain relatability to the middle and working classes of the 18th century, who were similarly struggling to get by and feed themselves and their families, who were subject to horrors in factories and mills, or who had to suffer abuse just for a wage.
For an 18th century audience, the Doctor and Pantalone characters probably drew parallels to the rising bourgeoisie, who were becoming richer and richer as industry expanded. In the same way that commedia dell'arte spoke for the people of the 16th century, Goldoni's new adaptation of the form related to 18th century Europeans who were undergoing massive economic and social changes as a result of industry.
The ideas espoused by Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto went on to change the political and economic landscapes of not only Europe, but the world throughout the 19th and 20th century. And in many ways, the ideas presented in the Communist Manifesto changed theater as well. But it's the idea of historic materialism and their view of history that can be applied even further back and used to explain the development of theater, especially in Europe, and the changes in European drama and plays. Theater is a glimpse into how people of the past live, their social lives, taboos, conventions, all that good stuff. Though many of the plays in the Western canon were written for bourgeois audiences or commissioned by the aristocracy, it's important to recognize that theater is, in its essence, a proletariat art form. It's by the people, for the people. It can't be limited just by one class or just by one voice. Playwrights and dramatists throughout European history, and really history as a whole, were not blind to exploitation or oppression coming from the upper class, and real-world class conflict often manifested into the works of playwrights and into theater movements that happened throughout history. Just as class conflict produced political revolutions and upheavals and changes in economic systems, class conflict also influenced changes in theater and experimentation on stages in Europe and beyond. Theater is always responding to changes, and it continues to do so even today. And it's important to notice how class and social life influences theater, because it always will, even past Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. Hi. I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed this class. It was really fun, and I enjoyed making this project. Yeah, I'm gonna miss taking this class next quarter, and it was really fun having you as a teacher.